The big political news of the past couple of weeks has obviously been the coalition's split.
We were on a break!
And then reunion. If the Nationals' aim was to highlight the fact that the coalition was a clown show, unfit and unprepared to govern the country, then they were more than successful. And in getting back together, all of the coalition's old problems remain. The big one being that it's still the Nationals driving the coalition agenda. So long as that continues, the Liberals will essentially remain unelectable in urban seats. So in splitting, the Nats highlighted many of the coalition's issues, and in taking them back, the Liberals haven't solved any of those problems. So back to square one, essentially. Nothing has come from this messy soap opera besides Jane Hume's hurt feelings.
Of course it hurts. It hurts professionally because I was such a hard-working and prolific and high-profile member of the front bench in the previous opposition, and it hurts personally too because Susan and I are friends.
And look, as much as it might be entertaining to look on as the coalition trip over themselves in political purgatory, let's remember the coalition aren't in government and don't look like they'll be in government for quite a while. It's important to acknowledge and remember because besides entertainment, the coalition clown show has really done nothing other than serve as an effective smokescreen for the government to carry on with some fairly, I'm going to be overly diplomatic here, questionable stuff. Let's start with Labor's new Environment Minister, Murray Watt. He'd have loved the distraction stirred up by the coalition circus as it gave him a little bit of cover to approve the extension of Woodside's Northwest Shelf, the country's biggest gas project, until 2070. This decision was an absolute stinker for a number of reasons. First, there was the timing. I think the reality is Labor were always going to approve this. It was just a matter of when, not if. And the coalition would have approved it too, no doubt. But the timing of this?
The chef's kiss.
Wait until a couple of weeks after an election win in the hope that by the time the next election rolls around, people will have forgotten how you sold the country out.
Classy, huh?
Then there was the Western Australian Labor government's decision to sit on a report that confirms that emissions are damaging rock art in the area and by extension the natural environment. They've sat on it and sat on it until they dumped it on a Friday post-federal election. No doubt to try and get the least amount of eyeballs on it as possible. I've talked about the Friday night dump before, and this is just another classic example. It's worth mentioning here that the federal government have been pursuing World Heritage listing for the rock art site that was the focus of this report, a process that was kicked off by the previous Environment Minister. However, the World Heritage listing process has stalled, with the World Heritage Committee referring the nomination back to the Australian government to allow it to prevent any further industrial development adjacent to and within the Murujuga cultural landscape. The report itself is massive, over 800 pages long. It's complicated. I'm not going to pretend that I understand it. The WA government put out a summary version, which is really nice of them. The only problem, the government has been accused of fiddling with the data and misrepresenting it in their summary. One of the report's lead scientists formally complained at the removal of one of the threshold lines presented in the summary, saying that if the green aqua dashed line were reinstated, it would show that 5 of the monitoring sites were experiencing pollutant levels above the interim guideline. And again, these are the 5 sites closest to industry. Putting aside the alleged manipulation of findings, the reality is that it wasn't just the release of the report that's been held back. The Albanese government had been holding back their decision on the Northwest Shelf for a while. The decision had been scheduled to be made before the last election, but then Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek held it back, saying that federal officials needed more time to provide their advice.
Sure they did.
Odd then that the new minister, after just a week in the role, felt he had all he needed to make an informed decision. That's a real odd set of circumstances we have there. And that decision was, of course, to extend what would be Australia's second largest polluter for another 40 years. With this decision, I'm sure I wasn't the only one thinking, are Labor any more serious about net zero than the coalition? Can you extend the life of fossil fuels into 2070 while still being serious about achieving climate targets?
No, you really can't.
When it comes to climate change, I guess we all know where the coalition stand. With Labor, though, their actions and their words don't always align. Anyway, if that wasn't enough, here's the real kicker. The Australian government are effectively giving away our natural resources for nothing.
According to the Treasury in 2023, to date, not a single LNG project has paid any petroleum resource rent tax, and many are not expected to pay significant amounts of PRRT until the 2030s.
The Australian government gets more money from HECS repayments than from the PRRT.
And a majority of this gas will be exported, therefore not helping to reduce the energy costs of Australians. It will help deliver Woodside a tidy profit though. And this was not about firming capacity, despite what the PM tried to argue. Barely any of that gas will be kept for Australia, and given the lack of infrastructure, none of it's going to make its way to the East Coast.
The Western and Northwestern Australian gas markets are, of course, a very long way from our eastern gas markets. There is no pipeline between them, so they are completely separate markets.
This was about a government demonstrating that when push comes to shove, they'll back the billion-dollar corporates over doing the right thing.
Sounds awfully controversial.
And again, while the coalition were imploding, dominating the news cycle, in the background we were reminded of the Albanese government's unwavering commitment to the prosecution of whistleblowers. First we had Richard Boyle, a former Australian Taxation Office debt collection officer, who exposed unethical debt recovery practices in 2017, revealing the ATO's aggressive use of garnishee notices that harmed small businesses and ruined people's lives. After his internal attempt at public interest disclosure was dismissed, Richard Boyle went public in 2018 through a Fairfax Media and ABC Four Corners investigation, prompting inquiries that would go on to validate his claims. His reward for blowing the whistle was being charged with 66 offences, which was later reduced to 24, essentially for actions such as recording conversations and photographing evidence to support his disclosure. For this, he faced potential life imprisonment, despite arguing for protection under Australia's PID Act. Remember that in March 2023, a South Australian District Court ruled that the PID Act did not cover preparatory acts for whistleblowing, which was a decision upheld by the Court of Appeal in June 2024 and declined for review by the High Court in November 2024. So effectively, Boyle was left to try and defend himself with his hands tied behind his back. So whilst the coalition were imploding, Richard Boyle pleaded guilty to 4 charges under a plea deal, allowing him to avoid jail but at the same time risking a conviction record. Richard Boyle's case highlights a lack of action on the government's behalf in the protection of whistleblowers and a failure of the Federal Attorney General.
Do better, be better.
Then we also saw further developments in the case of fellow whistleblower David McBride, currently serving time in prison after being sentenced to 5 years and 8 months behind bars in May of last year. I've looked at David McBride's situation quite a bit previously, so you can catch up with all the backstory in some of my previous videos. While the coalition was sucking all of the oxygen out of the news cycle, McBride lost his appeal against the severity of his sentence for sharing classified documents with journalists. The cases of both Richard Boyle and David McBride are reminders of the inadequacies of Australia's whistleblower laws, and they are reminders of the government's failure to do anything at all about those inadequacies. And again, a failure of the Attorney General to intervene. And just a friendly reminder that the government can intervene at any time.
It's true, as the member for Clark has pointed out in his motion, that the Attorney General has power under the Judiciary Act to discontinue proceedings.
The Attorney General can even step in and pardon David McBride after sentencing. I know you might be saying, but bro, the Attorney General's new. You can't expect them to have come up to speed and take any action after only being in the role for a week or two. Well, to that I'd say a week or two was apparently enough time for the Environment Minister to come up to speed with the complexities of the impact one of the country's largest polluters has on the environment. And it was enough time for him to decide that, yeah, extending this carbon bomb out to 2070 is a good idea.
So, which is it?
We don't need a culture of secrecy. We need a culture of disclosure. Protect whistleblowers, expand their protections and the public interest test.
So yeah, while the coalition are a total clown show, and watching them unravel has been entertaining, don't let that circus distract you from what the government are or are not doing. The government have a massive majority in the lower house, and they have tons of political capital to burn. So for me, I think it was quite telling that Labor's first acts of their second term were to continue to burn fossil fuels and to continue to burn whistleblowers. And they're able to continue to do this with the knowledge that for at least the remainder of their current term, they're going to face very little opposition.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.